You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm speaking with Anna Polonyi, a writer and teacher based in Nantes. She's here to discuss a word that's often translated as back to school, but actually means so much more. La rentrée. Welcome, Anna, to the podcast. Anna, you are a teacher and a former student in both French and American schools yourself. So I'm super excited to have you on to talk about la rentrée. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be invited to talk about the rentrée. I'm really pleased because the rentrée is actually one of my favorite times of the year. And I feel like this is kind of a nerdy pleasure that I don't get to talk about very often.
Yeah, I feel like, it's that, I think that the translation is often like back to school, but I think there's so much more energy around it. And maybe that's because we both run in nerdy circles, but I'm excited to get into the nitty gritty of this with you. So before we get started, can you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what your background is moving back and forth between France and America and in the various school systems there?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a writer and a teacher, and I'm Franco-American, and I did my kindergarten in the US and then came over to France as a first grader, and then so experienced many back-to-school days in France, and then ended up returning to the United States for my undergraduate years. And a funny thing that I was interested in talking about was the fact that I went to grad school both in France and in the US. So that kind of provided a cool basis for comparison there in terms of how they handled back to school vibes.
Yeah. So you're kind of like perfectly positioned to talk about both perspectives here. I grew up in the US, so, my like back to school mindset was always, you get the ads for like JCPenney back to school clothes and stuff, and you have like a shopping list of things you have to get. But, I feel like there is a big difference in sort of the vibe around la rentrée and sort of back to school season. So just off the top of your head, what do you kind of intuit as the major differences between la rentrée and back to school?
Well, I think the word itself, if we just unpack that for a bit, it comes from the verb rentrer, which is to return. So it's literally the act of returning. And if you actually look up the definition of rentrée, there are many different kinds of rentrée. The one that we're most familiar with and that, we use most commonly is sort of back to school, right? That meaning. But it's this idea of return. And I think that's really important because there would be no rentrée unless, like, if we didn't have vacances. So the reason rentrée is slightly different in France, I think, is, and the sort of the build up to it in some ways so much more powerful is because there's this like 1 month period from mid-July to mid-August where everyone takes their vacation days. And so there's something about the communal experience of returning to work or to school that really gives it a lot of its charm, I would say.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think, we do see it happening now at the end of August, beginning of September kind of period, which is, as you said, linked to school. And I think you have another guest for us on the podcast today. Can you tell us a little bit about Ophelia and her experience of the rentrée? How did you meet her?
Yes. So I, you and I had talked about doing this episode, and then I was in the south of France, and at a dinner, I met Ophelia, a very charming 10-year-old who was excited about the rentrée and, mentioned that she needed to prepare her bag for this. And this is, a good couple of weeks before the actual rentrée. So she had some cool things to say about her own experience, and I found that listening to her sort of was a good way to put, the real expert into the room, where she's going through the rentrée right now, actually today, as we speak.
That's so exciting. So Ophelia is sharing a little bit about her expectations for this year, specifically because she's moving from primaire to collège. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, let's listen to Ophelia.
So my name is Ophelia. I'm 10. I'm going to be 11 in October. And I live in this little village in France called Overlord.
How many people live in this village, aside from you?
Well, in the main village, there are about 1,000. But I live in the port, so there must be about 40, 50 people. It's true that it's hard to translate in English. It's the beginning of the new school year, but there isn't only one word, I think, in English.
Yeah.
The French have one word for it. They don't have a sentence. I'm moving into a bigger school. I was always used to littler schools. This year, in my old school, we were 16 pupils in the whole school. So it's a pretty big jump from 16 to 200. Because, it's going to be weird because, in the courtyard, I'm going to see kids who are, 14.
Giants.
Yeah. And it's always weird because, you came from being the biggest in your school, and then you go back to the littlest. And seeing there are not a lot of people, you kind of have to be friends with a little bit of everyone, with everyone. And, but in this new school, it's gonna be, different. Because you can only be friends with, 3 people, and then, see other people but not want to be friends with them. I guess they're pretty basic. They're, things like pens to be able to write. They ask for a black pen, a blue pen, a red pen, a green pen. Normally you write in the blue, you correct your errors in green, then you underline things in red. The black, I'm not sure though. Because there are some pens where there's 4 colors on the pen. So yeah, I have one of those. In France, they have these special books for if I'm not there one day, the parents will write it in the book, and then 2 days before, or a week or something, and then when I go to school, I'll show the book to the teacher or the headmistress, and they'll see the note and respond. So it's kind of like an email thing, except for it's in a book. You have to organize everything in your bag. What I do is I put the books first, and then my pencil cases. So 2 notebooks, for scribbling things, to take notes and things. So then I put those, and then with the dictionary and the grammar and conjugation books, and then my pencil case.
So we definitely have this sort of, that same kind of sense of excitement. I think maybe for American listeners who grew up going to American schools, that change between, your primaire and your collège might not feel quite so daunting. I think a lot of schools kind of feed quite easily from elementary school to middle school. Ophelia's experiencing quite a big change that she seems really excited about, so that's super cool. When you were in school here in France, did you get that same kind of transition between primaire and collège, between elementary school and middle school?
Oh, yeah. It was a big change for us as well. Just in terms of sheer size, not as drastic as what Ophelia is experiencing, but, definitely the sense of having gone from being a big fish in a small pond to suddenly becoming a very small fish in a big pond with actual teenagers. Yeah.
And Ophelia also shared with you, I think, some of the pieces of this back to school tradition that might feel familiar to Americans, which is the back to school supplies. And she, I mean, is such a kindred spirit for me, and I'm guessing for you, because I think we're both pretty nerdy at heart. She's super excited about her school supplies.
Well, I think there's also, the school supplies, it's something that I find kind of, I'm ambivalent about, because what would happen, and this may have changed somewhat, but we would get a list of very, very specific things to get. And like Ophelia, she got this list way ahead of time, and what would happen when I was growing up is that, we weren't familiar with the French school system. My parents had not gone through the French system. And so, they interpreted this list rather loosely. And it turned out that, when they said bring a certain kind of notebook, they meant they would give you the number of pages in that notebook, the color of its cover, the type of binding, the kind of inside look, whether it was ruled, what, squares, was it petit carreau, tiny squares, or large squares, grand carreau? All of that was specified in this shopping list. And so unless you were pretty detail oriented, it was kind of like an impossible challenge to gather all these materials in time. And you'd go to the supermarket or, the supply store, and everything would have been looted by the last week of August, because that's when everyone was, doing last minute shopping. So it was kind of a nerve-wracking experience.
I mean, it does also kind of point to like this strange like universality of experience that you get, in France, but in the French school system specifically. Like everybody is preparing the same exams, and a lot of the same books are going to be on the reading list. And I remember I did 3 months of my 9th grade year, so my troisième in France. And I remember sitting in a classroom and having the teacher literally say, okay, count 5 lines down and write like the title of today's lecture, and then underline it twice in red, and everybody has their ruler out. Like it's very precise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like surgery when you're taking notes.
Yeah. And as a teacher now, I know you teach mainly adults. Do you feel like that kind of exacting attitude is still expected of you as a teacher? Are they expecting that from you?
I think, the older you get within the system, the less time people will actually spend telling you how to take notes, or, how exactly you need to be doing something. So by the time they get to me, they're used to being a little bit more autonomous in that sense. And also these habits have been really deeply ingrained by that point. And so where I come in, I actually, enjoy giving students a lot more free rein and seeing how they react to that, because it's almost like a little antidote to my own experience of having been through the French school system, where I feel like it's now, this window of opportunity for me to create spaces where, there is a lot of freedom, and where from a pedagogical perspective, you can learn as well as play. And that is something that is fairly unusual, I would say. And it's nice to see how they adapt to that new idea.
And how do they usually adapt?
Well, some people really run with it. I teach at an engineering school where there are a lot of rules, a lot of structure. So I can tell that for some students, this is like the 2-hour period of the week where they just, feel like they have a lot more freedom and they enjoy it. For others, I think it takes a while for them to feel like they're not wasting their time, for them to sort of be convinced by kind of the pitch that I present them, which is that, you can enjoy this. Like it doesn't have to feel painful for you to be learning something.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Don't Miss This, which will clue you into some of the most interesting events happening in Paris right now. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. It reminds me a lot of, watching, like you said, I think as you come into higher and higher education in France, watching people kind of take control of what they want to study and how they want to structure their days, with that strong structure of having had all of these rules growing up, and then maybe being able to color outside the lines a little bit as you get older. So you alluded earlier to another part of La Rentrée, which I want to focus on as well, because, when we're talking about La Rentrée, we're often talking about La Rentrée scolaire. But because, as you mentioned, most French people are going to take a solid several weeks of holiday in the summer, whether they have children or not, there is this sort of shutdown of a lot of France in August. Like, I've had people who I emailed in early August and they are getting back to me on the 1st of September because that's when the rentrée happens. And so we're all going back to work, but there's also other pieces of the rentrée that feel more cultural. I'm thinking like specifically of the rentrée littéraire, for example. Can you tell me a little bit about the relationship between like back to school season and sort of cultural things that don't really have anything to do with school at all?
Well, the rentrée littéraire, I think, it's sort of, it's a 3, maybe 4-month period, right? From mid-August to the end of October, where a huge number of books are released in France. And on top of that, there are also literary prizes that sort of come out up until mid-November. And so I think it's, it is the most important sort of period of time for publishers. And that's partly because of the way prizes are set up. Everyone wants to have their book out and reviewed by the time the prizes are announced. And there's also, I think, beyond that, there is sort of this sense of I think, this nostalgia for the communal experience of the rentrée scolaire, which I think might perhaps motivate people to sort of think of things in terms of rentrée, right? The rentrée littéraire, like any sort of broadly organized event that's happening at the same time, could be considered a kind of rentrée, right? So I think that's what's happening with the rentrée littéraire, is everyone's coming back and then also, turning their attention towards books. And the same with the rentrée politique, which is, when Parliament is in session again, that's also sort of considered the big return to political, matters at hand.
Yeah. So on like an individual level, when you are living in France, like you're a person who doesn't have children, who doesn't work in the school system, do you feel like the reverberations of the rentrée are stronger here than they would be in the US?
Well, I think as you mentioned that, you emailed someone who got back to you a month later because, it was August. I think that is an effect that, a lot of people experience whether or not you have children in the school system, right? So there's a kind of slowing down and then an uptick of activity that you experience on a smaller scale around, the Christmas season. But really, I think because this is the longest period of time that people are away, it does end up sort of being part of, you do notice like sort of the uptick of activity and momentum, even just being back in Nantes right now. I noticed that more people are on the street, that the city has been very quiet this last month. And now all of a sudden it feels like half of the people are back. So I think it does sort of impact our perception of time, even if you're not sort of directly involved with the institutions that organize the rentrée.
And I think in the US, and this has probably a lot to do with our work hygiene, but we tend to, come back from vacation and it seems like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to work so hard to get on top of all the stuff that happened when I was away. Do you think that maybe the fact that everybody's away at the same time means that there isn't that kind of frenetic, like the rentrée could be maybe less frenetic here because it's so communal and societal?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it's pretty frenetic.
Okay.
That's the sense I'm getting. But I mean, that's just because I teach at an institution that has like a rentrée where they have to organize everyone's schedule within a week before the students arrive. So everyone that, I've been in contact with has been pretty frenetic, but that's maybe specific to institutions of learning.
Oh no, I assure you, mine is also frenetic. I just wasn't sure if that was a me problem.
So yes, if you walk into like a stationery store here at this time of year, you will often find a table with calendars, agenda. And here I've noticed that agenda tend to be, you can either get the kind of calendar that starts in January, right, and goes up until December, or you can get the kind of calendar that is based on the academic school year. And I have just noticed that because I don't know that in the US you would have that many calendars starting in September. And so it's interesting to me because even though, many people are no longer on an academic calendar, I think that sort of stays as a way to mark time. So, January, the 1st of January is kind of a very, like, it's an abstract notion of, why would that be the reset time, right? But there's something in a way very organic about feeling like, okay, September 1st or the rentrée is the real reset, where your year actually does begin again. So that's just something that, I don't know, I feel. I don't know if that necessarily speaks to other people's experience.
Well, I think that kind of makes sense, even when you consider, like you said, like January is kind of a random time to have the new year be, and the whole reason that we used to get a summer vacation in the first place was for, working in, so that kids could go help their parents work in the fields, and then they come back to school when the work is done. So there's other cultures, like I know that Jewish communities celebrate New Year in September, not necessarily at the beginning of September, but there is sort of a feeling of newness, I think, in September, maybe. That's interesting what you said about the agendas, though, because I think in the US, like, you definitely have a planner that might start in September, but I do feel like they're marketed to students very specifically, and to be able to get a planner that starts in September, even if you're no longer in school, kind of does tick that box of, okay, rentrée is not just about going back to school. So to your point earlier in this conversation, when you were saying that rentrée comes from to re-enter, what would you say we're re-entering then as a society?
I would say that collectively we're re-entering the fabric of our everyday lives, where if, vacations are the outlier, the time where we get to, travel and rest, then the rentrée is a return to not just work, but also sort of the dailiness of our lives.
I love that. We've all had a nice long relax, and it's time to get back into gear.
There is one story I had about the different sort of approaches to the rentrée.
Ooh, do tell.
Which is, so, I attended grad school in Paris, and then a couple of years later, I went back to school, this time in the United States. And both of these schools are sort of comparable in terms of their reputation, their size, their selectiveness. And I think it's interesting to compare sort of how they approached the first day of class, which was, in both cases, we gathered in a room, and, the students were eager and nervous, and the faculty lined up on one end of the room and briefly introduced themselves. And then the head of the program gave like a few sort of opening remarks to welcome the new cohort. And in the case of my school in France, the tenor of that sort of welcome speech was essentially, forget your social life, forget your friends, forget your family. You are here to work. You're going to work harder than you've ever worked in your entire lives. And then maybe you will be successful. And then a couple of years later, when I went to the US, similar situation, right? Similar kind of setup. The tenor of that sort of welcoming speech was more like, hey, congratulations. Like, you've already done the hardest part. You're here. You've earned your place here. Like, do whatever it takes, to like stay healthy, stay sane, make sure you have your support network, etc. And so it was really interesting to me to see that, in both cases, there's a real willingness to sort of welcome a new cohort and like sort of, bring them into the fold of this institution, but the approach is very different. And I kind of remember that sometimes in terms of just like pedagogy and thinking about my own job as a teacher here in France.
Yeah, that feels very true. And it always feels like, I mean, in the US, the application process always feels so arduous. And then when you finally get there, it's like you said, you're here. And in France, I mean, I went to university. I think you went to the Grande École, which is a whole different bucket of monkeys or whatever it is that expression is. But I mean, it has more of an application process than the French university does. But to go to university, I literally just had to sign my name somewhere. And then the expectation was that half of my class was going to drop out. And this was, a This is the Sorbonne. So it's the one that everybody's heard of, but it is just sort of your work is not finished when you show up. And obviously your work's not finished when you show up at an American university either, but I like the vibe feels very, very different for sure. Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining me. And thank you for bringing wise words from Ophelia this Rentrée season. I just have one last question for you before I let you go. And that is, what is your favorite word in French?
Oh, gosh, that is a good question. So I just learned a new word, and I really like it because it's French, but it's regional. Because I was in the south of France, people were sort of using expressions that are drawn from Occitan, which is a language that I've never actually heard spoken since it was sort of, highly discouraged in the generations before us. But they taught me an expression called, it's chaupiner.
Oh.
Chaupiner comes from Occitan, and it means to awkwardly, or to like sort through something, or to like prod something. Like, for instance, if you're like kind of playing with the food on your plate, someone in the south of France where I was would have said, oh, arrête de chaupiner dans ton assiette. Stop.
Oh, wow.
Stop, playing with your food. So I think that's a pretty cool word because it sounds really funny. And it's, I guess not non-standard French.
I like that one. Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us, and have a bonne rentrée.
Oui, bonne rentrée. We didn't even talk about that, but that is a regular way to say, to greet people or to sign off on emails at this time of year. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope everyone has a great rentrée.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.